Some people criticize China does not have democracy because people do not have right to vote. This certainly is not true. In this video, let's discuss China's election system. The criticism about Chinese people do not have a right to vote is not true. The law in China clearly states every adult citizen has voting rights with certain exceptions. However, in practice, whether people actually can exercise voting rights is another issue. Just like in the United States, some people choose not to vote. Same situation happens in China. However, there are some practical obstacles in China to make people unable to vote. Before getting into discussion of the subject matter of this video, first, let me mention several basic conceptions relating to elections. The first one is suffrage, or universal suffrage. Based on Encyclopedia Britannica, suffrage means, in representative government, the right to vote in election of public officials, and adopting or rejecting proposed legislation. From the Black's Law Dictionary, suffrage is defined as a vote, the act of voting, the right or privilege of casting a vote at public elections. In Collins English Dictionary, universal suffrage, also called universal franchise, general suffrage, and common suffrage of the common man, gives the right to vote to all adult citizens, regardless of wealth, income, gender, social status, race, ethnicity, or any other restriction, subject only to relatively minor exceptions. Therefore, suffrage is about whether a country's citizen has equal rights to vote. Most recent history of fighting suffrage was about women's rights to vote. In the United States, women's suffrage was first introduced in Congress in 1878, but only got recognized until the law was passed by both houses of Congress in 1919, and the same was ratified by the states in 1920. The campaign for women's suffrage was long and difficult. Many American women remain unable to vote long into the 20th century because of discrimination laws. In China, women were first granted the right to vote in 1947 through the Constitution of the Republic of China, which is current Taiwan government, but were not explicitly enfranchised until 1953, after People's Republic of China was founded. In China, to be able to vote and be elected is a basic constitutional right for citizens after they have reached 18 years old, regardless of ethnicity, race, gender, occupation, family origin, religious belief, educational level, property status, or residential status. Therefore, Chinese people do have universal suffrage and can vote. Another important conception is about direct election or indirect election. These conceptions are important to understand how people to vote for their representatives during the elections. Direct election means voters to choose representatives without any middleman. Indirect election requires a middleman to vote for choosing a representative on behalf of the voters. Let's use the American election system to explain. The House representatives and congressmen are voted by direct election. This means the voters directly elect their House representatives and congressmen. But the President of the United States is voted through electoral college, which is indirect election. Although American popular voters can still cast votes for who is the next president, but only votes from the electoral college are decisive. Popular votes do not count. That is why Hillary won the popular votes, but lost the presidential bid. Between universal suffrage and direct elections, each turn has different focus. In China, at the beginning, China had used the term universal suffrage for the grassroots election. However, since 1982, the terminology universal suffrage has been replaced by direct election. China has no longer used the term universal suffrage in its election laws. Now, let's talk about election in China. Like other countries, the decision-making in China's Congress is through voting by elected representatives. Therefore, election is extremely important. However, China's election system works differently from the Western one. In China, direct election only happens at the grassroots. For example, election in townships, districts, or counties. Up from city level to central government, China uses indirect election to elect representatives to the Congress. This means representatives of municipal, provincial, and national congresses are elected by representatives from lower level congresses. Up from city level, voting happens through those elected representatives. Indirect election is like American electoral college, but China's indirect election covers more layers in election process. In the United States, electoral college's votes make the president. In China, votes by National Congress representatives make the president. There are some similarities. As direct election represents basic conceptions of election process in China, let's talk how it works at grassroots in detail. At the grassroots, election events are organized by election committees. The work of election committees includes setting up election districts and allocating the number of candidates, voting registrations, setting up election schedules, publishing information about candidates, organizing voting events, approving validity of election result, and announcing elected representatives. At grassroots, the election districts are set up for people's convenience to vote. Typically, the election districts are based on residential zones, but election districts can be set up in business locations if they are big enough to cover voter population. For example, schools, universities. Usually, 1 to 3 candidates are allocated to each election district. Eligible voters, including new and those whose political rights has been restored, must register before voting. Upon registration, voters' eligibility is permanent, unless deceased, relocated, or losing voting rights due to criminal conviction. People with mental health and not able to vote could be excluded from the voting list, but exclusion of people with mental health issues needs special approval by the election committee. At grassroots, electoral candidates come from different sources. The candidates can be recommended by a political party, an organization, or by no less than 10 individual voters. In China, the candidates are more likely to be nominated through recommendation by a party or an organization. However, independent candidates have become more and more popular. China uses margin election to pick up enough candidates to compete in the election. Margin election means the number of candidates must be more than the number of representatives to be elected. At the grassroots, the number of electoral candidates can be 1/3 to 1 time more than the number of representatives to be elected. For example, if a number of representatives to be elected is 3, in an electoral district, then the electoral candidates can be 4 to 6 people. At the city, provincial, or national level, the number of electoral candidates is 20% to 50% more than the number of representatives to be elected. This number is smaller than the grassroots candidates. As independent electoral candidates has been more and more popular in China, practically the number of electoral candidates could be more than the number of the same, defined by margin election rule. For example, according to the rule, if the candidates are 6 at the most, but the actual candidates are 10 or 20, what the election committee will do? In China, the election rule allows pre-election vote, which means the voters could pre-vote to select the most popular candidates to get into the formal election. Same margin election rule applies to indirect election at the city, provincial, and national level. In China, electoral campaigns are not as popular as the same in the Western countries because of the cost of election campaigns. However, China has set up some rules to make sure the voters know who the candidates are. For example, the election committee must introduce the candidates to the voters. The party, the organization, or a group of individual voters who are recommending a candidate also have opportunities to introduce their candidate before the voters. And at the voters' request, the candidate must meet the voters in person to present him or herself to the voters. The term of an elected representative is 5 years, unless he or she resigns, is deceased, or relocated, or has been impeached according to election law. This infographic illustrates the voting process in a grassroots election. In China, there are 5 administrative levels, from Congress root to central government, including townships and villages, counties, cities, provinces, and central governments. The grassroots include districts, counties, townships, and villages. At the grassroots, China uses direct election, but up from grassroots, China uses indirect election, which means Congress representatives are no longer elected by citizen voters directly, but by elected representatives from lower-level congresses. Indirect election uses similar election procedure as direct election, but its scale is much smaller and simpler because the number of voters are less than popular voters at the grassroots. Voting right is part of political rights. For those who have convicted of certain types of crimes, they could lose their political rights. However, not all crimes are subject to this penalty. The crimes subject to deprivation of political rights are those serious, antisocial, or endangering national security, and with long-term prison sentence. In the United States, it is a common practice to make felons ineligible to vote. In China, when sentence of deprivation of political rights has been completed, the person's civil rights are restored immediately upon completion of sentence. Typically, the relevant authority will announce to that effect on a date when person is released. The restoration of civil rights in China does not need to go through a special proceeding. In the United States, the civil rights restoration varies significantly. In some states, for certain crimes, people could lose voting rights indefinitely. In China, the number of representatives at each level of Congress is calculated by a formula. That sets up a base number, then adds additional numbers calculated based on the population. The formula also sets up a cap if population is large, or a smaller base number if population is small. This chart explains the formula, how to calculate the number of representatives in each level of Congress. At the grassroots level, such as township or village, the number of representatives could be less than 40. At the National Congress, the maximum number of representatives is 3,000. That is why China's National Congress Assembly has always been a big event in China, partially due to its massive number of attendants. National unity is a forever political policy in China. China's election law adopts a special rule for ethnic minorities to have their elections, and to ensure they have their own voices in each level of Congress. The special law lowers population requirement based on calculation formula, and also makes election procedure more flexible for ethnic minorities. For example, they can have their own electoral district, or they can join another electoral district for election. Also, the law requires all election materials must include the language commonly used by ethnic voters. China is a single-party-led country according to its political structure. In addition to the Communist Party, there are 8 democratic parties providing supportive and advisory function to the leadership of the Communist Party. Because of this, many people are confused by whether a member of the Democratic Party will be elected to the Congress. The answer is, although the Communist Party has the leadership in most of China's governmental, judicial, and legislative branches, the law does not say that the Congress should be dominated by the Communist Party members. The rule of election is not based on political status and any other facts, but the citizenship. China's constitution says any Chinese citizen, as long as he or she has reached 18 years old and has not lost political rights, is entitled to vote and to be elected. So, a Democratic Party member is eligible to be elected and to become a representative to the Congress. As a matter of fact, many members in the Congress are Democratic Party members. China does not have 2 houses in the Congress like in the United States, but a single Congress mixed with elected members from different parties and people groups. People might wonder what the rule is in China if there is any mistake or manipulation of election. In China, legal remedies for election matters mainly appears in 3 areas. The first one is voter eligibility. The second one is impeachment of a representative. The third one is obstruction of election. For voter eligibility, if any voter has question about that, a complaint can be filed with the election committee, and the election committee must address the issue within 3 days. Upon the complaint has been received, the decision from the electoral committee can be challenged before a court. An elected representative could be impeached, with or without cause, as long as the impeachment has met certain legal criteria. Theoretically, this means a Congress representative is removable and replaceable at any time. Impeachment of an elected representative is an election matter and should not be adjudicated by the court. The question whether a person is impeachable is decided through the voting process. To replace a vacancy in the Congress also has to go through voting process for the replacement. During the election process, other legal issues might arise, for example, bribery, undermining election, forging electoral documents, etc. These acts are subject to administrative penalty or criminal charges. Independent electoral candidate is a phrase used in some Western medias. This phrase does not appear in China's election law. It should mean electoral candidates nominated by individual voters. As mentioned previously, there are many ways to nominate Congress candidates, as long as it meets legal requirements. Certain number of eligible voters can nominate their own candidates in the election. Individual electoral candidates have gained more and more popularities in China because people have realized the importance of election in policy-making process. People might know that Hong Kong and Macau have representatives in China's National Congress, but might not know Taiwan also has representatives in the National Congress. As a matter of fact, Taiwan held 12 Congress seats in the 4th National People's Congress in 1975, and 13 seats since 5th National People's Congress in 1978. Hong Kong has 36 Congress representatives. since the 9th National People's Congress in 1997. Macau has 12 Congress representatives since the 10th National People's Congress in 2002. Through this video, you should have a good picture how China's election works. Now, let's go back to the original question. Why some people feel they do not have a right to vote? I summarize several possible reasons. First one is, independent electoral candidates have gained popularity but still not a common phenomenon in China. Second, China does not promote election campaigns like those in other countries. Third, direct elections only happen at the grassroots. Although participation rate in voting has been high, there is no good mechanism to facilitate the effective oversight for elected representatives and the communication between elected representatives and their voters. Fourth reason, migrants, overseas Chinese typically have been ignored during any election year. The factors behind all these reasons could be practical or structural issues. It is a practical issue because a lot of people do not care about election. It is a structural issue because Congress traditionally has been treated as a part of government. Although today the functions of the Congress have become more independent and stronger. To improve the participation of election at the grassroots, with today's technology, China could do better. For example, creating technology platforms to facilitate the popular voting and the communication between voters and elected representatives. With the improvement of economic situation, with more education, people want to voice more for a better society. Compared with the Western countries, China has a unique governmental and political structure, which makes China take a different approach in its election system and the path of democracy. The purpose of election is to achieve democracy and to improve common welfare for people. Democracy is progress, not a final destination. From certain perspectives, and through its unique system, China, being labeled as a country with no democracy, has achieved something that many Western countries could not do. I want to invite you to think deeply, why? This is all for this video. Thank you for your watching. If you like my channel, please subscribe it. If you have any question, please leave your comments below or interact with me through my website or social medias. See you in next video.